Hey, Saretsky here. As always, Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you're getting sort of value or entertainment out of these videos, all I ask you to hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. A little bit of housekeeping notes. As promised, this channel is continuing to expand. I've recently added on a podcast, combining forces here with Keith Dicker at IceCap Asset Management and Richard Diaz with Acorn Macro Research. So the show is Loonie Hour. The Loonie Hour is a macroeconomic based show that is ultimately focused and dialed back into sort of Canadian investors and how it's going to impact the typical Canadian. And so that show will be released on all podcast platforms. Right now, we've just got it on Spotify, but I will be also uploading the video format of that to YouTube here as well. So there'll be plenty of additional content for you to soak up. So I highly encourage you to check out that. Basically, the premise of the show is essentially the three of us, and we try to make it more of like a dialogue, as if you were sitting next to us, having a beer, at the restaurant and just chatting about, financial markets and everything that's happening in the world. That's kind of how we wanted it to sort of look and feel. So again, highly encourage you to come, check that out. Appreciate the support. But I want to touch this week on, some recent comments last week to really keep beating on this guy. Some comments exactly a week ago from Tiff Macklem, commenting on the recent performance in the housing market. So let's clip into Tiff right here.
What we are seeing now, though, is actually housing is slowing. And I think to some extent that reflects the fact that as the economy reopens, this demand for extra space is diminishing. You can now go to a restaurant. You don't have to eat everything in your own kitchen. So as things normalize, I think you're starting to see some normalization there. But I mean, household debt is high. It is a vulnerability. It is something that we are concerned about. And Canada's experience is pretty similar to many other countries. I know housing has come back very strong in the United States as well. I think what's a little different about Canada is that the vulnerability in Canada was probably higher ahead of the COVID crisis, and as it's come back quickly, that vulnerability has come back faster in Canada than in some other countries. But Canada, in many respects, looks like a lot of other countries, particularly medium-sized countries.
So Tiff says the housing market is slowing down. And so, lo and behold, here again, a week later, we've now got the national housing data that has been released. I mean, the data, I'm not sure what Tiff and Co. are looking at the Bank of Canada. It's probably the same transitory inflation that they're also looking at. But national home prices, by looking at the home price index, the benchmark price, from August to September increased on a monthly basis by 1.7%. So you have home prices accelerating on a national level at 1.7%. So you had this pause during the summer months. And now national home prices are reinflating again in September. And I can tell you, at least here from a feet on the ground perspective of, actively watching and participating in the Vancouver housing market on a daily basis, the housing market is piping hot. So you have, if you look at the national housing data, national home sales declined on a year-over-year basis. And makes sense considering the fact that last September, on a year-over-year base effect, last September was an all-time record high nationally for home sales. So, yes, Tiff is right in that home sales activity has slowed down, but home prices are still inflating, I think, which is ultimately, I think, what most people care about. I think they care less that sales are slowing down and more so what's happening with home prices and affordability. Because when we ultimately look at the bigger picture, how I'd always tell people to sort of filter through the noise. So whether it's me or if it's any other pundit on TV or it's an economist on the news, if you don't trust them, if you don't trust me, and if you're not really too sure about the housing market, you're not sure of the source, I always just say you can literally just cut through the noise. forget what I'm saying, just cut through the noise and look at the months of inventory. That is pretty much going to tell you what kind of housing market you're in. If you're in a buyer's market, if you're in a seller's market, that's basically going to tell you the future direction of the price direction as well. So nationally, months of inventory is at 2.1. It actually declined again on a month-over-month basis in August. So basically, between 4 to 5 months, 4 to 5, if you have months of inventory between 4 to 5, that's considered a balanced market. Anything below that goes into a seller's territory, and once you push above 5, you're in a buyer's market. In fact, you're in a pretty strong buyer's market. So that's all you have to look at. The fact that you have months of inventory at 2.1 should tell you pretty much all that you need to know. You basically need inventory levels to essentially double from here just to get back into balanced territory. Now, how long is it going to take to basically for this months of inventory to essentially double? I can tell you for a fact it will not happen by the end of this year. In fact, from a seasonal perspective, the housing market follows seasonal patterns. So what you're going to see here is in August, it's going to be a relatively strong month for new listings, and then as you get into mid-November, new listings will just basically fall off a cliff. There's really very, very few people that list their homes for sale in the end of November into December as you get around the holidays, and then of course, into January. You'll start to see as the listing will pick up again in February of next year. That starts the sort of early spring listing season. So there's really not a whole lot of hope on the horizon in terms of getting inventory levels to a healthy level, which then is going to moderate price growth. So right now we've got national home prices growing 1.7% on a monthly basis, up 21.5% from last year. I mean, if we look at the chart here, we would talk about transitory type levels of inflation. Well, I mean, guess what, Tiff? I mean, transitory national home prices have tripled since 2005. They have literally tripled. The chart is obviously up and to the right. Now, again, certainly not here to do a pump and dump of the housing market, but I really just can't emphasize enough that people have to just sort of do their own research. And if you feel like the housing market is too risky for you to jump in, that's totally fine. But don't take a central banker's word for transitory inflation. Nothing to see here. We will fight inflation. How are you going to fight inflation with global debt to GDP at 365%? The last thing that people should be worried about is over-levered Canadian households. I mean, if central banks suddenly start hiking interest rates, you'll have to worry about governments defaulting. And this is something we talked about actually in the Loonie Hour on the most recent podcast. If you don't remember, one of the there's a lot of the provinces in Canada are highly, highly indebted. And, Keith actually had flagged this several years ago in one of his reports. And ironically enough, at the onset of the pandemic, when credit spreads started to blow out, and there was no liquidity in the provincial bond markets, it was actually the Bank of Canada that came to the rescue and started buying up provincial debt for the first time ever. So it isn't just the households that you got to worry about, it's the entire system. And so the Bank of Canada, I think, in my opinion, along with a lot of these other central banks, they are pinned into that corner that inflation is high and rising, but we can't really fight it because nobody can actually stomach higher interest rates. So anyways, it's going to be an interesting 3 to 6 months here moving forward, watching the CPI data. I mean, all we have to do is look at the U.S. Just printed, the data just came out for the month of September, printing 5.4% on the CPI. I mean, just a nasty print. So Canada will be releasing their CPI print here on October 20th coming up. Last reading at 4.1%. if I had to guess, circle back on this. I'd like to hear your comments in the description below, in the comment section below. I'm going to go with, as a betting man, the CPI rings in at 4.5%. So again, still quite a bit below our U.S. neighbors to the south at 5.4, but I think Canada inflation rate pushes up to 4.5%. We'll see. Fairly compelling. I was actually just recently offered by the bank a variable rate mortgage at 1.25%. So if inflation rings in at 4.5%, I will be a happy man. Real rates. Let's check in on real. Speaking of that, let's check in on real negative rates across many of the developing markets here. You can see you're kind of in this era of real negative interest rates. And so, but this is really ultimately what we've talked about a lot in the show. One person who has really nailed it on the head is Russell Napier, who I've talked about at length. All you have to do is go ahead and Google or type into the YouTube search bar here, Russell Napier. He's got a lot of good interviews on Real Vision and the likes, but really ultimately has called for, at the start of the pandemic, about 3 to 6 months in, he called for CPI inflation in the U.S. heading north of 5 and sustaining that level for a period of time, basically due to the expansion of credit, right? I mean, in the U.S., you had the M2 money supply growth. I think at one point it hit 25% growth on a year-over-year basis. In Canada, we hit 18% growth in the M2 supply. So what you really have here ultimately is this, global coordinated, currency devaluation. It's almost like, it's kind of like a stealth default, right? Like you can default through just, I can't remember the term, but you can basically default through not paying, right? You can default through fiscal prudence, or you can default casually or suddenly, under the radar through inflation. So I actually think that despite central banks, coming out and easing our concerns about inflation, transitory inflation, that in reality they actually want and they need inflation when debt levels are this high. They need inflation. Inflation is going to be really the key driver to get debt to GDP levels at a more healthy level, so that at some point down the road, my guess is 10 plus years, you can then begin to even consider normalizing, interest rate policy. So as always, let's see. I want to see the CPI print coming in here in Canada next week. I want to hear your bets. I'm on at 4.5%. And last but not least, go and check out the Loonie Hour. See you next week. Oh, and I should add, the Loonie Hour will be releasing, maybe not on YouTube, but it'll be releasing on Spotify, iTunes, all the podcast platforms every single Friday. So you'll get that Friday show with myself and the crew, and you'll still get these weekly Saturday vibes every single Saturday. So, cheers.